7. Mars, rampant. The tribune, Metellus Nepos, was the first officer to be summoned to Silva's tent. He arrived at mid-morning to report all weapons and machines ready to move. Nepos had hardly expected to find his general still lingering over his bath, but he noticed at once how markedly his zest for all things seemed to have been restored. "You have enjoyed a good night's sleep, for a change, sire?" "Splendid, thank you, Nepos. I could easily delude myself I am a youth again." Later, Nepos was pleased to confide in his fellow officers how their general had indeed returned to high spirits and intended to consult the auspices this very noon. And knowing of the Jewess, all of them were secretly grateful to her. Word of impending action passed swiftly through all the camps and was confirmed when Silva appeared in full battle regalia and marched briskly along the Principia to the tribunal, where the priest and his staff had been advised to wait upon him. While most generals normally took the auspices in the relative privacy of the praetorium, where the ceremonies were witnessed only by their officers and personal guards, Silva believed in opening the ceremonies to all ranks, thus partly compensating for his refusal to make a formal harangue before battle. As he strode resolutely along the broad Principia, Silva sensed a renewal of himself. It came in part, he thought, from his new sense of completeness, which last night with Sheva had created. Now it was augmented by the continuously risen acclaim of his legionaries. As he passed before them, their voices were at first very few, and the men seemed to call his name without enthusiasm. But by the time he approached the tribunal, the hoarse cries of greeting and pleas for immediate action became an overwhelming confirmation of his original popularity. He heard his name shouted thousands of times, the very repetition of it serving as a mighty cadence for his steps. Silva, Silva, Silva. Always the last syllable was heavily accented, so that it could be sharply terminated, and the tempo increased. Words of Silva's solitary parade spread quickly through the camp, and at the sight of his trim figure arrayed in his finest battle armor, and with the swing of his scarlet-lined cape seeming to emphasize his limp, few men could resist cheering. Here in the hottest part of the day, when a man's breath was like sucking fire, marched their commander, as splendid, as full of vigor as if he were advancing on Rome itself. The tilt of the head spoke of great events about to unfold. The confident way he raised his hand again and again to greet nearly every face turned his way left few legionaries unmoved. They picked up their shields and beat them with the hilts of their swords, following into a steady rhythm to match their gruff shouts and singing. As the uproar increased, so did Silva's sense of fulfillment. Now, he thought, now was the time for successful conquest, no matter what the auspices foretold. Thunder on the left is a good omen. Very well. Here is thunder to shake the walls of the desert, and it can always be kept on the left if a man simply turns to his right. The great noise from the legionaries rolled down the incline, splashed over the eastern wall of the camp, fell down into the wadi, and rose to explode like a series of waves against the awesome facade of Masada. Here, amid the shouting, Silva thought, was the ultimate right. Here, once more, was might and right. He, in spite of arguments, voiced by a wretched Jew, was Rome civilizing the world. Silva paused before the steps of the tribunal and made a show of staring up at the mountain. Then, to the delight of all who could observe him, he smiled and raised his first fist towards the ramparts. The jester released a tremendous shout as he mounted the tribunal. Silva studied the faces of his officers and became all the more certain this was a moment of triumph. And why not, he reasoned. Here was veteran soldier Flavius Silva, Roman patrician and general of the armies, returned to the fold. Here was home. Here were men who knew his family history and his personal history. Here were comrades in arms who would follow him to the ends of the earth. He handed his helmet to Attius and greeted each officer with a separate display of affection. Arvianus, is all ready in communications? Liberalius, have the other camps been notified? Dear Rubius Gallus, what will you do with yourself now your ramp is complete? Read a few of my books, perhaps. Clemens, I venture to say your disciplinary problems will cease as of this night. Fabatus, dear fretting friend, how will you account for your abundance once we take over what the Jews have hoarded? He greeted the priests with less spirit. There were 5 of them now, wearing their embroidered tunics, bound with brazen belts, and their high conical caps. These were the priests dedicated to Mars. These were the priests dedicated to Mars, so each wore a ceremonial sword, held a short spear in his right hand, a shield in his left. Silva had always been ill at ease when priests were officiating. They sense my doubts, he thought. They are endowed with one power, and that is to see inside a man, and looking through me, they discover a skeptic. I make some priests lose their appetites, which is the most grievous wound they will ever suffer. Silva was amused because for once it was the priest who seemed uncomfortable as he watched their anxious preparations. Apparently word of the ramp's completion and his decision to take the auspices had been late in reaching them, or some other factor had gone awry. The high priest, an unfortunate man in Silva's opinion because he was afflicted with a stutter as well as a lisp, now became nearly unintelligible as he ordered the brazen tripod, which was sacred to Apollo, placed at a certain distance from the altar. He fused about frenetically when his aides could not succeed in promptly lighting the fire, and finally the ancient goat chosen for sacrifice refused to mount the tribunal of his own will, which was in itself a bad omen. During the confusion, Silva held animated conversations with his officers and frequently smiled and waved at the ever-increasing number of legionaries gathered to witness the ceremony. Watching the priest struggle with the goat, Silva confided to Rubrius Gallus, "The priest may consider it a bad omen, but I consider that fellow simply a smart draft evader. He has not the slightest desire to do his bit for a Roman victory." Silva exuded so much confidence both officers and those legionaries who had pressed close enough to hear him laughed easily. At last, when all was reasonably satisfactory to the high priest, he began to sing the verses called Axamento in the style of Latin, so archaic no one could understand him. "I doubt if he understands it himself," Silva muttered. He was ready for battle now. He knew he would conquer, and all of this was simply marking time. When he had done with his vocalizing, the high priest recommended an auguratorium be opened. It was a huge wooden cage, which had been transported across the desert. Silva remembered, at considerable cost and effort. Within the cage were some 100 birds collected from whatever sources the priest had been able to discover in Palestine, and were of every variety from swallow to seagull. Silva had known commanders who, believing everything the priest said, had been either vastly encouraged or hopelessly depressed by the behavior of the birds after their release. If the priests proclaimed the birds should fly south, and they flew north, then the auguries were unfavorable. "Woe to him who defies the auguries," the priest cried, and they opened the cage. To Silva's open amusement, the birds flew in all directions, and some even refused to leave the cage. One squealing seagull knocked off a priest's cap in passing, and Silva clapped his hand over his mouth to hide his laughter. "This is very good," he thought. "This time, before battle, I became more alive than at any other time. No, it is not the same now. I am not as much alive as I am with Sheva at my side." In spite of the birds' erratic behavior, the high priest advised Silva that he was pleased. He called attention to the goat, which was standing before the altar without restraint, and he pronounced his submission as a very good omen. When Silva nodded and told him to proceed with the libatio, the priest crumbled a salted bran cake above the goat's head, and after tasting a mixture of frankincense and wine himself, poured it between the animal's horns. Next he plucked the highest hairs between the horns and threw them into the fire. With a gesture Silva considered altogether too grandiose for the occasion. At once another priest struck the goat with a heavy maul and asked, "Agony?" And the high priest answered, "Hockage." Then all the priests stabbed the beast with their knives, and caught the blood in goblets. They poured the blood on the altar, and since the goat was obviously not fit to eat, Silva readily agreed to their proceeding with holocaustum, so the entire carcass should be consumed by the fire. Only the liver was saved, and Silva stood patiently while the priest made a great business of examining it. They cut the liver into two parts, the familiaris, which would indicate forthcoming events for the legion, and the hostilis, which would denote the destiny of the enemy. Silva watched while they sought the protuberances at the ends of the blood vessels, called caputs, and he knew that a liver in which such lobes might not be observed could be a very bad omen. While he waited for the verdict, Silva raised his head and watched a buzzard circling against the blazing sky. "There," he thought, "is an omen. I can understand and believe." 7.2 Staring at the ramp, Silva found it difficult to believe he had been responsible for its creation. Now cleared of workers, machinery, animals, and tools, it appeared of much vaster proportions, the total effect being so stunning it seemed a capricious outgrowth of nature rather than a purposeful creation of man. It rose as an enormous shoulder supporting the body of Masada. It stood as a blinding white monument in the sun, and Silva found it necessary to openly express his awe. "Our friend Gallus," he solemnly told us, "his staff, has dared to affix his own nose to the face of the earth." He, as he had earlier regarded a buzzard, Silva now watched the sun, for its rate of descent during the afternoon was of the utmost importance, and he was pleased to see it coincide with his program as exactly as if he had commanded of it. Since every detail of the final assault had been discussed for months, there had been no need for a formal staff meeting after the priests had finished their rites. Silva had simply looked away from the buzzard and declared, We will now take the mountain from the Jew. And that had been the end of it. At once, all of Roman order came into evidence as the carefully groomed military machine bestirred itself. In a matter of minutes, mounted couriers were sent off to the eastern camps and to the southernmost camp with orders to send their previously established quotas of legionaries and auxiliaries. Guards were doubled all around the circumvallation. Oh my God, try that again. Guards were doubled all around the circumvallation, lest any Jews attempt to escape during the coming turmoil. Every cohort in the 10th Legion was ordered to make a light meal and stand in fully armed readiness for combat. Silva believed the peculiarities of this engagement would place the greatest demands on the engineers, so he assigned them 2 cohorts, the 3rd and the 5th, as supplementary strength. All of this had been long ago arranged, and as a consequence, the legionaries went about their task as if they were still at drill. The main assault tower had been moved to the base of the ramp even before the final work had been completed. Now the engineers, under the watchful eyes of Rubrius Gallus, made the last inspection of their winches, ropes, and tackles. The ramp was very steep, and the tower of tremendous weight. It must not fail to arrive at its destination, intact and on schedule. The great battering ram rested on a separate car, which would be hauled up the ramp after the tower. It was the longest and the heaviest ram any legionary had ever seen, but lacked the traditional ram's head on the pounding end. There were no smithies capable of such metalwork in all Palestine, so the engineers had substituted a simple iron cap to protect the wood. Silva secretly marveled at Rubrius Gallus's confidence in claiming the great beam would swing with ease. Yet Gallus had explained in his heavy engineer's voice, "Once the ram's center of moment is known, we will adjust the slings accordingly, sire. After that, a small child could establish momentum simply by pushing rhythmically. Give us the protection, and we will knock down your wall." And he would, too, Silva thought. Rubrius Gallus was the kind of man who had built the pyramids, and if he was commanded to knock down Masada itself, he would find a way. He would have protection. Indeed, Silva thought, because of some foresight on the part of his general, Gallus would have a most formidable friend in the sky. At last the torture the sun had inflicted on Romans would be repaid, because it would be shining directly into the eyes of the Jews during the assault. And while it blinded, it would also brilliantly illuminate every target daring to show itself behind the wall. 50 of the most expert Arab bowmen had been selected to ride in the armored top of the tower. If Gallus's figures were correct, and Silva had never known them to be otherwise, the tower should be approximately halfway up the ramp 2 hours after it began to move. At that location, the bowmen would be within range of the ramparts with the sun at their backs, and as the tower rose, so would the sun descend. Such, if all went as planned, the Jews would have the sun almost directly in their face for the latter half of the tower's ascent, the critical time, in Silva's opinion, when they might offer the most serious defense. Now Silva remembered how he had stood with Gallus so long ago, when the 10th had first come to the desert, and he had suggested that as long as such an enormous effort must be made to conquer Masada, perhaps they should steal an advantage from nature. The month of April offered 13.5 hours of day and 10.5 of night. Since they must attack from the west, why not angle the proposed ramp to take full advantage of the western sun? Gallus had grumbled unhappily about complications, but he had gone away and calculated the azimuths and the altitudes of the sun at the time he claimed the ramp would be completed, and he had found that a slight angling toward the north would bring the sun directly up the center. Thus, even before the ramp was begun, both men knew the assault must be at this time of day and approximately on this date. It was a secret they shared only with each other, and now, with all in readiness, including the sun, they were compelled to celebrate. "I thank you, good Gallus," Silva said. He embraced his tribune and pounded affectionately on his heavy shoulders. "The master of time, the master of mountains," he laughed, "the master of the sun." And for the first time since he had known him, he saw Rubrius Gallus actually smile. Behind the assault tower, and already poised at the base of the ramp, were two testudos. Under each turtle-like structure there was a catapult manned by legionaries of the 5th cohort. Ammunition for their future use had been carried up the ramp by Jews and stacked near the two platforms built out on each side of the ramp at a carefully calculated distance below the assault tower. The position was considered to be sufficiently far down the ramp to escape direct fire from above, yet still close enough to provide flanking protection for the all-important tower. The testudos were defended by Balkaric slingers, who would be obliged to fight in the open. Silva did not expect many of them to survive the day. Now he found himself astonished at the vast number of people his simple order to attack had brought together. If there was not a light wind to blow the dust away, he thought, at least half of them would be lost to view. Great clouds of the stuff rose from the baking desert floor and drifted across the moving spectacle in a series of grimy curtains. Sometimes Silva could see black clusters of the more than 15,000 Jews who he knew had been assembled along the ramp and would soon be hauling at the tackles. Most of them were lying down in the dust or were propped against the larger stones, apparently dozing. Legionaries, with their whips coiled in a loop, stood at intervals near the Jews, and for the moment seemed to take less interest in their charges than a shepherd in his sheep. Silva estimated there must be 20,000 human beings waiting or near the ramp for his final word of command. Titus, he remembered, had seemed able to take this sort of thing with ease when he stood before Jerusalem. But I cannot, which I must assume is the difference between princes and ordinary generals. I cannot accustom myself to the fact that with a nod of my head 20,000 human beings will engage themselves either directly or indirectly in slaying less than 1,000. And I must confess to myself now, while I still dare think, that I shall not remember this afternoon for the rest of my life, but also some animal instinct is causing my mind and body to tingle with anticipation. I am deeply in love and dream of tranquility in Praeneste, and yet I must acknowledge to myself these are the moments for which I was born and trained. I do not hate any Jews, much less Eleazar ben Yair and his pitiful little tribe of troublemakers. I do not even believe the world will benefit from their deaths. And I must believe, if they were Gauls or Germans, but die they must. Those are my orders. Silva saw the hills to the west were speckled with groups of camp followers seeking the very best vantage points to observe the assault. It would be a better deed to estimate those leeches, he thought, but unfortunately they were not mentioned in my orders. He took a deep breath and held it for a moment, as if wishing to absorb and retain within him every element of the scene. And he looked quickly to his left and right, and to the sun, and behind him, shifting his weight jauntily from one leg to another, smiling and trembling with excitement, for everywhere about him were the shouted orders and curses and cheers and the great metallic dissonance of war. Again he glanced at the sun. It was almost time. He folded his arms and thought how very long he had waited for this moment. He was standing on a promontory near the base of the ramp with Rubrius Gallus at his side, in recognition of his importance to the moment, and the balance of his staff waiting expectantly behind him. Their immediate position was surrounded by the bearers of Silva's personal standards, his lictors, and those who carried the wild boar and eagle emblems of the 10th Legion. 5 maniples of Silva's Praetorian Guard had been deployed about the common area by the centurion Gemenus. A matter of custom, Silva thought, rather than any real need to protect the 10th's commander. Gemenus was all soldier, and this had been the way his men had been disposed in Gaul and in Germany. Hence this was the way it would be done in Judea, regardless of the impossibility of an attack from the rear. Commendable, thought Silva. There were so many foolish mistakes and unforeseen snags befouling any battle. The major factor preventing total chaos was iron-bound devotion to form. Form had built the Roman army. Form would hold it together. Form had prescribed he remove the crest from his helmet in anticipation of combat, and he noticed with satisfaction how the ritual had been repeated by all his officers. He studied the behavior and disposition of his troops, whose numbers were lost in the distant clouds of dust. Many of them were wearing the new laminated loricas, which were now of brass rather than leather. As protection for a man's chest, they were superior. But the legionaries complained bitterly of the increased weight. He noticed with open disapproval that some of the men who passed nearby had discarded their spiked Caligulas, eventually preferring the comfort of Palestinian sandals. So did an army start going native, he thought, when it had served too long in a foreign land. Now it seemed a pity the majority of these fine troops had been brought all the way to the desert simply to stand about and swat the flies while they watched a distant battle. Yet there was room for so many men on the ramp. 2 cohorts, the 2nd and the 4th, had been designated as first through the breach. They had been drilling every day against units of the cavalry that had been deliberately dismounted for the project. The results had often been almost too realistic, and 1 cavalryman had been killed in the resulting melees. Silva chuckled. Everyone in the Roman army knew how the average legionary and cavalryman loved each other. Take the cavalryman's horse away and stand back while the foot soldier delighted in teaching him some humility. The sun! The sun! Move! Are you waiting for our tubas to sound the attack? The 2nd and the 4th cohorts were moving into position now, already formed into their fighting units, with the hastati at the fore, the principes in 2nd place, and the triarii in 3rd. Silva watched them carefully and could find no fault with their discipline. Good enough. Form and discipline built soldiers, and these fellows would not charge wildly through the wall the moment they spied an opening, and most certainly be overwhelmed as a result. Discipline. The maniples would not unite directly behind each other, and simply run for the enemy. They would take position obliquely in the form called quincunx, which would separate them by such intervals. Each man would have a space of at least 3 feet about him. Thus, he had room to fight, and his unit would not present an easy mass target to the enemy. Son, are you mired in the sky? I do not intend to seem impatient, but you have not descended the width of a finger in the past hour. He wiped at the sweat rivering down his cheeks. His helmet irked him. It was suddenly much too tight. Then why wear it when there was not the slightest chance any missile sent from Masada could reach him? Custom-formed discipline? Of course, I am a soldier in the Roman army. He was pleased to notice the 24 Greek surgeons, the total complement of the legion, had set up shop at some distance to his right. Fear of what further damage the Greeks might do made an already wounded legionary extremely wary of the surgeons. But Silva had chosen the best men he could find and had long ago initiated a campaign to encourage greater belief in their ministrations. But still, they were known as the butchers. Suddenly he realized his preoccupation with the sun had been so consuming he had not once bothered to look up at Masada. Now he turned to study the ramparts. No sign of activity. He touched the arm of Gallus and said in an undertone, "The Jews are too quiet. I will confess to you, dear friend, they are strangely capable of giving me moments of doubt." But Gallus was himself preoccupied, for he had been watching an engineer who stood in exact line with the ramp, yet at a considerable distance from it. For some time he had been bent over a transit, and now he had turned to face Gallus. He raised both arms slowly and clasped them over his head. Gallus waved his hand casually in recognition of the signal and said, "We may proceed now, sire. The sun has become our ally." Seven point 2. Shem, son of Ishmael, stood in the tower which had so long been his home. It rose from the ramparts like a spike and was the most important tower of all, since it was adjacent to the imperiled western gate. Shem knew only too well he had been given the responsibility for such a vantage, only because of his extraordinary skill with the bow. So with all the determination of his 16 years, he had resolved to deserve his reputation. Now he was a nervous host to Eleazar ben Yair, and to Heth, son of Ezra, and to Esau the Sicarith. He knew them to be the greatest 3 men in the world. Oh, most certainly. And here they were being as easy with him and speaking in the familiar with him as if he were their equal in age and honor. Oh, yes, this time was worth all the months of loneliness and watching Romans who remained so tantalizingly just out of range of his arrows. He had shown them the intricate decorations he had scribed on his arm guard to hide, and while flexing it, praised his double convex bow. Such a weapon gave the maximum distance, and with the grip so close to the spring, the highest velocity. Yet as he enthused, Shem was puzzled by the faces of these 3 men, known to all as the most veteran fighters on Masada. For most of the afternoon they had been watching the ponderous approach of the Roman tower, and still they had not displayed the slightest elation. Here at last were the Romans deliberately coming within range, and neither Eleazar ben Yair, nor Heth, nor even Esau seemed excited. Shem had boasted how he would soon avenge his father 50 times, for such was the number of arrows in his store. And Eleazar ben Yair, on hearing him, had simply laid his hand on his shoulder and said nothing. He had shown them the arrows, caressing them and delicately adjusting their feathers to assure true flight, and he had vowed every one of them would penetrate the flesh of a Roman. He showed them how he had painted on each one the Hebrew letters, for Shem, son of Ishmael. He tried not to show his disappointment that not one of his guests had so much as said they were depending on his marksmanship, or cautioned him about the south wind that had come, or even wished him luck. They seemed hypnotized by the actions of the approaching Romans and simply stared down at the ramp in silence. At last, Esau spoke, in a voice so low Shem could hardly understand him. At Jotapata, we boiled fenugreek and managed to pour some on their gangways. It was so slippery they fell down, and it worked for a while. We do not have any fenugreek, Heth said. And Eleazar, who had hardly bothered to look at the arrows, even when they were held all shining before him, said, We're going to have the sun in our eyes. And Shem, who worshipped Eleazar ben Yair, not only because he had always treated him as a man, but because he had, in addition, actually known and fought with his father, thought he had never seen his idol so forlorn. (7.22) Zidon the Pharisee was bent like a blade of grass before a tempest, and all the other Jews along the thick rope were hunched in the same fashion. There were this same rope more than 1,000 Jews, including those men who had come down the mountain with Zidon and given themselves to the Romans. Ezra, the Sadducee, was not among them. He had been crushed by one of the first great rocks rolled down from the heights of Masada. There were on the opposite side of the ramp another 1,000 Jews, and these also were bent backwards with their bleeding heels dug into the flinty surface of the ramp. And they, too, pulled on a great rope which was as thick as a man's forearm. As these 2 columns of force inched down the ramp, so did the heavy assault tower creep upward, for the ropes over which they grunted and sighed and cried out in exhausted pain were led through a system of blocks and tackles, which the tribune Gallus had ordered, set in place during the preceding night. Thus the combined strength of 2,000 Jews was transmitted through the rope to the tower itself, and even Zidon, whose eyes were stinging with his sweat, could occasionally raise his head and see the tower moving. There were times when the massive cart which supported the tower sank into the surface of the ramp or lodged against a half-buried stone. Then the Roman engineers, who were following closely behind the tower, would investigate the cause, and soon the order would come down for greater effort. The Jews would cry out to the sky and to each other while they tried to summon more energy from their weariness, for unless they did succeed in again starting the tower on its way, the legionaries would certainly lay on with their whips. The tribune Gallus, being experienced in human endurance, had recommended the ropes be secured and the Jews allowed to an interval for breath 4 times each hour, and this was done. This was a time of whimpering for them all and agonized sobbing for a few, and it was a time when the legionaries passed down the line and removed those who were already dead from exhaustion or dying. They heaved the bodies off to the steep side of the ramp and watched them bounce and tumble off the rocks until finally they lay crumpled in the wadi below. Then the legionaries sent word down to the base of the ramp, giving the number of replacements they required. These numbers increased at each halt until as many as 100 Jews were replaced each time. The car which supported the great ram was now close behind the tower. It was also set in motion through a series of tackles, but since it was of much less weight than the tower, only 200 Jews on each rope were required. They were positioned inside the lines of the other Jews and knew that if any part of the system at the top of the ramp gave way, they would certainly be crushed. Yet they did not have to pull quite so hard as the others, and very few of them died of their exertions. Behind the ram were the 2 Key Catapults, which would later be joined by others. These machines were on sledges and were hauled upward directly by the strength of 20 Jews, straining along the 5 ropes leading from each sledge. Thus there were 100 Jews pulling each catapult, and they suffered terribly until the tribune Gallus saw they were not enough, and rather than let them fall too far behind in the procession, sent 50 Jews to push on the ends of each sledge. By late afternoon, when the sun was yellowing, the assault tower was very nearly in place, and all of the other elements were also moving upward according to the tribune Gallus's original schedule. Seven 7.2.3 The south wind, which had risen so suddenly, rendered Silva's original command post untenable. He had called for his horse Fury, and had ridden to windward of the tremendous column of dust which rode from the ramp. By late afternoon it ascended nearly to the height of Masada itself, and was swept northward on the wind until it obscured the horizon. All of Silva's staff, except Rubrius Gallus, had followed him, and were now also mounted. He turned to them and declared, "I trust so much dust will not dim the enthusiasm of our friend the sun." Instantly he regretted uttering the words. What a stiff comment, he thought. Pre-battle babble, obviously spoken in the rather wistful hope an opportunist will quote you when historians get around to recording your name, if indeed they ever do. What a pompous fellow you have become, Flavius Silva. So suddenly the almighty phrase-making, world-conquering Roman general. I puke at your new pose, and call upon a great and realistic woman called Sheva to laugh at your boundless conceit. Then quickly he said to the others, "Of course our infallible Gallus has undoubtedly taken the dust factor into his considerations, and I suppose if the sun is not in the right place, he will move it. Here on the windward side of the ramp it was possible to observe the progress of the tower, since there was no dust preceding it. But from underneath the tower a continuous cloud of white dust blossomed and formed a long tail which compounded itself and enveloped the entire length of the ramp. Somewhere in the murk, Silva knew there were thousands of Jews and 20 cohorts of legionaries, but he could see only small groups when the wind pleased. "This wind may give us trouble," he said to the tribune Arvianus, "but we may be confident Gallus will turn it off when he no longer desires it." Arvianus, who was overly stimulated by his commander's high spirits and attention, laughed and said, "Poor Gallus, it's all his commotion. Now he's eating his own dust." "By the gods, Arvianus," Silva growled, "I may appoint you to bathe our good Gallus with the utmost reverence when this day is done. Meanwhile, you will acquire a speck or two of grime yourself. You will take yourself to the ramp at once and discover why the catapults have not yet fired." And Silva's words were lost in a shout from his staff and the surrounding Praetorians, for they had seen the first stones loft upward from the dust, arc, and descend behind the western gate of Masada. They heard the strong arms of the catapults thump against the crossbars again, and then again, and Arvianus sighed with relief. (3.24) In all of his life, even before his battles with other men had begun, even in the ancient history of his days when peril descended upon him from the natural will of God, had Eleazar ben Yair ever known such anxiety. For at last, after an eternity of waiting, his people were joined with the Romans, and it was not at all as he had anticipated. The enemy were mostly invisible, either concealed behind the iron plates of the great tower, which was still moving inexorably toward the western gate, or hidden in the white dust which foamed across the ramp like the sea exploding against a reef. He had expected some harassment from the Roman catapults, but nothing like the destruction they had already wrought. Esau and Heth, both having previously experienced such attacks, had agreed that if a man simply stayed alert and heeded the warnings of approaching stones, the hazard was more dangerous to the spirit than the body. A number of the weaker men, including some of the infirm, had been posted along the ramparts to sing out the imminent arrival of the Roman stones. Eleazar watched the collapse of the system with dismay. Somewhere in the clouds of dust, the catapults were set and triggered. There were few targets visible to Shem or any of the other archers. Eleazar had spaced along the ramparts. The great 50-pound stones came out of the blinding sun, and by the time they were seen by the observer, they had arrived. As soon as he realized the Romans had no need to aim their catapults at specific targets, but were content to pound the area about the gate, Eleazar had sent every man to a safer post. Yet by the time the transfer had been completed, and confusion dispelled, 9 of his best men were dead, including Jacob, son of Tema, and 14 others were so grievously injured they would never fight again. Eleazar was heartened only by the remarkable change which seemed to have come over his fellow consulmen. At last they appeared to be united in resolve, and even the sniveling Matthias had refrained from the suggestion of surrender, and the people who were his tribe were now also transformed. Adonai, there on the most exposed section of the rampart, shouting defiance at the Romans, was old Jacob, son of Sosas, a man normally afraid of the dark. Near him, waving a sword, menacingly, was Maris, son of Belges, who was not only a thief by trade, but had often boasted that he was the laziest man on Masada. There was Argilus and Lud, Aram, Uzel, Onam, Kedar, Cush, and Ham, all with a new and determined look about them. All of them had hitherto been the most voluble and recalcitrant of sea lawyers, forecasters of doom, and complainers about rations. They were those well known to have schemed their way out of Jerusalem, but were now at last willing to fight Romans. Eleazar had met with the council on the roof of Herod's old palace. It was built mostly of wood and was in serious disrepair. But from this vantage they could watch the ominous process of the tower and still remain out of the line of catapult fire. By turning away from the sun, they could also look down upon the entirety of Masada itself. And what Eleazar ben Yair saw within the citadel troubled him deeply. For he observed how all of the women and their children had gathered near the crumbling building, which had once enclosed a small bathing pool. All through the siege, this area had been an oasis of lightness for the people of Masada. The delighted screams of children splashing in the water and the perpetual undertone of gossiping mothers had created an air of normality never to be seen elsewhere on Masada. Now the women huddled together in silence, and their children pressed against them in terror. They stood transfixed, as if already dead, and they stared at the western gate and at the great stones which came thumping down behind it, with eyes that refused to believe. Eleazar thought, "Those eyes will haunt me forever." Just as Silva had foreseen, the owners of those eyes had chosen to interpret all he had ever said as unassailable truth. The Romans would never come. Had not Eleazar defied them? The Romans would melt in the sun because Eleazar ben Yair said they would melt in the sun. Those Romans who did not die of disease or melt in the sun would have no energies left to attack the mountain, which had become their world. Eleazar ben Yair had said it would be so. And here, almost at the gate, were the Romans. Eleazar looked away, because he could no longer bear inspection by such eyes. If they would only reproach him, it would be so much easier. But they would not forsake their trust in him. They were asking salvation, and worse, expecting it. Abigail had spoken the truth when she said even God had deserted the people of Masada. Now he suddenly remembered how, after cursing the indifference of Jehovah, she had taken to muttering mysteriously about her own private plans for their future. Seven 2.4 The tribune Rubrius Gallus had never known such satisfaction. All of his secret doubts concerning the conquest of Masada were now dissolved one after the other until it seemed he could do no wrong. The ramp had not only been completed on schedule, but was also on the precise incline he had planned half a year ago. All along he had known an error of even 2 degrees in grade would cause an infinite number of problems, some of which might prove unsolvable. A steeper grade would have squared and perhaps even cubed the apparent weight of the assault tower. A softness of the surface could have created the same effect. In either event, the ratio of Jews required for hauling would be correspondingly increased, and it was now obvious the ramp simply could not have accommodated more bodies. Likewise, the circumference of the hauling ropes and the blocks to guide and multiply the power of the Jews would be inadequate. And where in all the world were bigger ropes and tackles to be found? Rubrius Gallus found he still had qualms when he reviewed all the factors which could have gone wrong. Yet all was well. The entire operation had gone so smoothly, he was compelled to immerse himself in it as completely as he had during the days of building, as if he had created a great beast and feared to unleash it without his closest supervision. As the assault tower moved upward, Gallus followed behind, choking in the dust, wiping constantly at his irritated eyes, and moving constantly from one concern to another. There were times when he could hardly see the length of his arm, and his engineers, along with the assault legionaries, and even the Jews, marveled at a Roman tribune, who would suddenly appear out of the murk and share their misery. He constantly inspected the rope on both sides. He crawled underneath the tower to ensure himself the engineers were applying enough fat to the axles. He exposed himself to possible fire from Masada by personally inspecting the hauling blocks, which were fixed to the upper side of the tower. He climbed into the tower and stood on one of the great cross members, listening anxiously to the continuous groans and squeaks emanating from the tremendous structure as it crept upward. He nearly suffocated before he satisfied himself the occasional rocking motion was not causing excessive strains in the basic design. Later, he climbed to the armored tower where the Arab bowmen waited out the ascent. Once above the thicker dust, he found he could survey the whole of the ramp, the 10,000-odd Jews waiting in reserve along the hillsides, and the complete attack force of the 10th Legion. On a rise behind the multitude, he saw the cluster of Silva's faces and standards. He noticed with relief that Silva's command post was already in shadow, so the timing was still exactly as he had planned. As the distance to go decreased, Gallus saw a corresponding restlessness among the Arab bowmen. He looked through one of the slits to assure himself the uttermost tackles were running smoothly. Then he descended from the tower and emerged into the smothering dust. Now he must see if the all-important ram was coming along properly. He was troubled to find the distance between ram and tower had increased, so he stood quietly in the maelstrom of dust while he considered whether it would be more expeditious to augment the number of Jews on the rope or drive those already laboring much harder. He decided on the third possibility and sent for 100 Jews to push on the cart itself. Then he went back to the tower, which had become like a magnet to him. Never in his career had he been so proud of anything. Gallus made his way back up the column of Jews on the south side of the ramp until he passed the last hauler and came to the bare rope. He watched it inch past him for a time and clamped his hand over his nose in a desperate attempt to filter the dust. A variation in the wind momentarily cleared the area, and he instinctively turned his sore eyes towards Masada. Almost instantly, an arrow pinned his hand to his mouth as Rubrius Gallus fell. Most of the shaft protruded from the back of his neck. On it was painted the Hebrew letters for Shem, son of Ishmael. 7.3.1 The molten sun seemed to be burning a wound in the western hills as Eleazar ben Yair drove his people to exertions he had never thought possible. The great tower approached inexorably like some primeval giant. It screeched and groaned as if in agony, but always it moved upward, and it was already obvious nothing would prevent its union with the western gate. When he paused to estimate the ever-decreasing distance between the tower and the rampart, Eleazar could catch an occasional glimpse of eyes behind the tower's iron plating, and he saw these were the Arab bowmen who had already killed many of his people. From Shem's lookout just south of the ramp, Eleazar could now see a part of the car which was being hauled behind the tower. He saw that it supported a great ram, and he understood how once the tower was in place, the car would be drawn in through its backside, and the man swinging the ram would be perfectly protected. He was satisfied the Romans had also been hurt, for when the occasional breeze cleared the curtains of dust, we saw the ramp was strewn with dead legionaries. While he watched, hoping to more exactly estimate the time remaining before the tower was in position, he saw Shem pick off 3 more legionaries who had only momentarily exposed themselves. "Ah, Shem," he said, embracing him fiercely, "if only we had 1,000 of you." When the tower was within javelin distance of the western gate, he left Shem and ran down to the shelter of the ramparts where the people had collected. There was no use manning the eastern or southern walls any longer. Here at the western gate, the battle would be fought. When he arrived among those who remained of his fighting force, he found them more defiant than he had hoped. They intended to stand and fight. They were saying to each other how they yearned for Roman blood on their blades, and they also insisted they were ready for them. All fine talk, Eleazar thought, and he noticed that those who had previously fought Romans were saying the least. He decided against reminding them of Roman efficiency at slaughter, not while the will to resist was still so hot within them. There was still much to be done. There had been vessels which would not have gone to the bottom of the sea if their crews had not despaired. Who knew? Storm had been known to subside without any reasonable explanation. And was the thumping of catapults any more ominous than the crashing of waves? Suddenly, Abigail appeared to be everywhere he looked. She came blinking toward him out of the scarlet sunset, and her rheumy eyes called out to him. She even managed to catch his arm once and shake it urgently. "Now," she cried, "have I wasted my precious breath trying to dignify a hyena? If you wait long, I will sing when the rats are feasting on your face. Call all the people to you and tell them now how to grasp victory." He pushed her aside and ran to the wall of the western palace, where most of those who had not actually posted on the ramparts had gathered. He first asked them if they were satisfied to die here where they were, and when they answered they were not, he told them to rouse themselves by any means and follow Asher, son of Joktan, who stood beside him, and do all he bade them do. They were to tear down the very wall which now protected them, and pull away, particularly the great timbers which were the framework of the palace. "We will build a wall within our wall," he announced, in a voice he was careful to keep confident as ever, "and we will build it in such a way no Roman ram or any other device can knock it down." Then he told them how they would take the great beams of the palace and drag them to the area behind the western gate and lay them down parallel to each other and stagger end to end, so they would in combination become like a great lattice. And he explained that as they were doing this, he would send all the women except those who were pregnant or nursing the very youngest children, and they would carry earth to be dumped between the timbers. He raised his right hand and pounded his fist against the open fingers of his left, allowing them to yield, and thus demonstrated how the longer and harder a ram struck such a wall, the more compact it would become. Masada is ours. There is no power on earth able to drive us off this mountain. I promise you, it will remain ours, forever and ever. Soon after they set to work, the great tower crept within a spear's length of the western gate. Then it paused for a time, as if exhausted from the climb, and then once more, marshalling all of its creaks and groans, crawled through the final veil of dust until it crunched heavily against the gate. 7.3.2 When a courier brought the news of Rubrius Gallus's death, Silva was so distressed he went at once to the field hospital where the body had been carried. He had always loathed visiting army hospitals, where it so often seemed more blood flowed than on the field itself. But Gallus had been a fine officer and deserved a farewell salute from his commander. More importantly, Gallus had been a friend, which made the visit all the more abhorrent. There was something about the sight of a friend killed in action which always shook him more than one loss to natural causes. The timbre of a friend's voice was still to be captured because it had been heard only so short a time before. The familiar gestures were too easily remembered, though the friend's body lay still. Timoleon, the Greek, insisted on explaining why his fellow surgeons were not busier. He waved his hands across carefully prepared displays of lancets, forceps, cauteries, and trephines. He cited Dioscorides as his mentor for the plants he had available with pharmaceutical properties. Opium, for example, he proclaimed, holding a pinch before Silva's eyes. We find it more effective than mandrake. As he continued describing in clinical detail how the extraordinary marksmanship of the Jews had left far more dead than wounded, Silva found his elaborate Greek and feline purr more annoying than ever. He only half heard Timoleon's oration on gangrene and erysipelas, for he was looking down at Gallus's craggy face, wondering how he would phrase the obligatory letter to his family. Our dear brave comrade charged into a horde of the enemy, fearless of their numbers. Our most valued friend and great officer fought the enemy hand to hand. He led his soldiers through the wall. He was ambushed by a horde of Jews. Our gallant tribune and dear friend perished with your names and that of Rome upon his lips. I feel confident our great Vespasian will award him. Silva sighed. It would be something like that. Certainly it would not do to say that Gallus had been so obsessed with a pile of sun-baked stones he had needlessly exposed himself to enemy fire, or that he was apparently blowing his great nose at that fateful instant the enemy took advantage of his foolhardiness and removed such a valuable officer from the Roman military rolls. Because he was a tribune and known to be confident of Silva's, the arrow had been removed from Gallus's mouth, his face had been cleaned, and his torn hand placed in a reasonably natural position. while Timoleon hummed on in his labyrinthine Greek, describing the efforts he had made to save Gallus, and unctuously explained how the arrow had successfully pierced his hand, the tongue, the pharynx, the common carotid, and finally the jugular vein, and how the wounds had been treated with dittany and other analgesics, just as if there had been any hope of life. Silva could only think how Gallus's nose appeared to be more monumental than ever, and his brow much less troubled. Good Gallus, he thought, you are at last engaged upon that adventure for which I had hoped to buy you a ticket. Even my most intriguing books cannot match what you are seeing now, nor can the ramp which you built here compare with your present endeavors. That is, I think so, dear friend Gallus. And I wish there were some way you could reassure me that it is so. I am melancholy enough about losing your company in this desert of deserts, but I should be all the more desolate if I discovered a man of your talents had suddenly become no better than the next man. I would say, then, that all we have done as Romans has been a total waste of time and effort. Do you agree to that, dear Gallus? Have you now supplemented your already extensive wisdom and perhaps reached the conclusion that, among other things, we are all fools, Jew and Romans alike? As twilight came to the desert, Silva rode slowly back toward his command post. On his own right hand he now wore the golden ring, which had been Gallus's privilege as a tribune. He would send it to his family, along with the letter of condolence, and he thought it ironic this would be the only time in his life he would willingly wear a ring. Attius, his aide, rode with him, and both men kept their eyes on Masada, which still caught the very last of the sun. Silva could not detect any movement along the ramparts, and he was surprised to see so little activity along the ramp itself. Everything seemed to be waiting. The catapults were inactive, and the helmets of the legionaries as static as cobblestones. He suddenly realized the continuous heavy concussions which had pounded the desert air most of the afternoon had ceased. Near the base of the ramp, he intercepted a messenger who was so breathless from his long run he could barely speak his mission. He said he had come from the tribune Sextus Cerealius, and that the wall of the Jews had been breached. Then what are they waiting for? The Jews have built another wall within the first. I am to tell you, the ram will do nothing against it. Ah, good Gallus, why could you not have survived the day? A wall which could not be breached by such a ram must be a very unique wall indeed. Silva dismounted and turned Fury over to Attius. It was a long climb up the ramp, and he would have preferred to ride, but man and horse would present too attractive a target for the Jews. He told Attius to transfer the command post to the base of the ramp and wait with the staff for further orders. Advise them something has gone wrong, and we may be all night about this. Fabatus should make provisions to feed the cohorts who will actually engage with the Jews. Those in reserve can wait. Advise Arvianus, I will have the cavalry brought to the ramp, where they are to stand by. They should be ready to come up the ramp immediately on signal. Advise Liberalius he should personally assure himself all of his sentries are doubly alert by nightfall, particularly along the eastern circumvallation. There is something very odd about these new developments. I would not be surprised if the Jews were planning a breakout. Silva handed his cloak to Attius and started up the ramp. Before he had taken 100 steps, the pain in his bad leg became excruciating. He reached the assault tower in the very last of the light. There, nervously awaiting instructions, he found the tribune Sextus Cerealius, son of that rash man who had commanded the 5th Legion at Jerusalem. Nepotism, Silva thought, has once more conquered good sense, for Cerealius, the younger, was anything but a reproduction of his incautious father. Instead, he was a shy and studious boy Silva had long considered might make a much better poet than a soldier. Only the tolerant Rubrius Gallus would have agreed to take him under his wing and hope to make a man of him. And Gallus, of course, as an engineering officer, was not expected to be killed. Now, Silva realized, the whole assault had waited over an hour, while this child stood about gnawing at his nails, and he reminded himself to speak with Titus concerning the selection of tribunes, particularly the younger ones who might by ill chance be left with important decisions. There were 3 veteran centurions fuming in silence behind young Cerealius, and he was certain any one of them would have conquered the problem, had he but had the authority. Escorted by Cerealius, and the 3 centurions, Silva climbed to the armored tower. An Arab bowman was ordered back from his slit to Silva, could look out upon the broken wall of Masada. So Silva could look out upon the broken wall of Masada. He had rather expected to see some movement, perhaps even a face, but he could not perceive the slightest sign of life. The silence was eerie, yet he had been warned that if a man exposed himself even momentarily, an arrow would find his flesh. He saw how the ram head had passed the crumpled masonry of the original wall, and appeared to be jammed against a newly constructed barrier. Ignoring Cerealius, he turned to question the centurions. Would it help to move the tower closer? We can set the Jews to hauling again. No, sire. We have not the proper support beneath the tower, and the angle would change. The problem is the wall itself. It is built mostly of wood, and gives before the ram. Silva went back to the slit and saw how costly it would be to attempt storming the new wall. The Jews would have every advantage, and might even succeed in destroying the striking force of the 10th Legion, since they would be taking them on only a few at a time. There was simply no room for more than 2 or 3 assault ladders. He turned away from the slit. We have a south wind, he said thoughtfully. If we can't knock it down, we'll burn it down. His suggestion met with less enthusiasm than he had hoped for. The centurion Lupus, who was the senior of the 3 and whom Silva knew to be a nearly fearless man, cleared his throat unhappily. Well, well now, Lupus, Silva asked. Shyness ill becomes you. What is it that vexes you? The wind here is fickle as a whore, sire. If we set fire to the wall, and it shifts, we stand to lose this tower. Here, Silva recognized, was the age-old dilemma of any commander. Lupus, of course, was absolutely right, and it was all too easy to envision how flames might jump the narrow gap if the wind reversed itself, and equally easy to picture the tempers of both Vespasian and Titus when they were informed that regrettably, due to an unfortunate error in judgment of their esteemed commander in Judea, the conquest of Masada would take at least another 3 months, if indeed it could be attempted at all this summer. And Lupus, he knew, was sincere in his desire to win this battle. But at the same time, he was protecting himself and his immediate group with the armor of caution. Before witnesses, he had made a statement which would clear him of all blame if things went wrong. Silva reminded himself that the cautious rarely won battles. Set fire to it, he snapped. .3.3 When Eleazar ben Yair saw the first flaming arrows streak across the stars, he called Hillel, the priest, to him and said, Now raise thy voice to Jehovah and beg him for the shift in the wind. He is obviously wary of listening to me. As he stood watching the blossoming fires along the new barricade, he soon realized the flames were spreading so rapidly it could not last through the night. The south wind blew the flames across all of the area where any further defense might be built, and the heat and the noise was that of the monstrous furnace. All of the western part of Masada was now bright with the fire, and sometimes Eleazar could see the eyes of the watching Romans through the slits in the armored top of the tower. Before and behind the tower, he saw the glittering helmets of the assembled cohorts, and he knew they were waiting only for the fire to diminish. All of his leaders were now about him, not only the council, but also Simon, son of Judas, Ebal, son of Ludum, and Tarshish, son of Elam, all of them heads of large Sakari families and dependable fighters. There was no man or woman or child upon Masada who was not in some way under the influence of these men, and with many of them Eleazar had shared other battles. Never had he seen their faces so uncertain. He said to them, "Oh, hear me. I want to hear you. Now is the time. We have need of each other's minds as much as the support of our hearts, of our hands." Alexis, the slippery one, raised his hand for attention. While the Romans are so busy on our west, why not escape to the east? We can fight our way through the eastern camps. They are nearly deserted. Josiah, whom Eleazar had always considered a better baker than a fighter, suddenly became hysterical. What would he do with our women and children? We can't drag them into an open battle. He began to weep and moan, and they had all been betrayed by Eleazar ben Yair. Eleazar sensed an undercurrent of rebellion, the more dangerous and unpredictable because no one made any attempt to quiet Josiah. Their tone was desperate, and their eyes spoke of their seething desire to vindicate themselves. He spoke to them very slowly, trying to calm what was already too calm. Even if some of us managed to fight our way through and escape beyond the camps, even if the Roman cavalry did not pursue us, where would we be but in the open desert? At this time of year, without water, I fear. Once, in the Negev, I nearly perished of thirst, Ham said, and I tell you all now, I would as soon feel a Roman blade in my belly. At least I might take the Roman with me. Oh, I say we could carry enough water to reach En-Gedi, or even Herodium. The Jews there would look after us. Ludum thinks like a child. He is thinking of times gone by, Esau yelled. All the Jews who would defy the Romans are here on Masada. The others would not dare give us so much as a greeting. Tarshish cleared his throat mightily and spat, which was his usual way of begging attention. He was a shy man, in spite of his long record of Roman assassinations from Caesarea to Jerusalem. And he so rarely spoke in a meeting, his attempt now, Eleazar thought, only proved his fears. Something must happen soon to unite, or the only rule would be anarchy. Tarshish was saying, "Oh, I remind you, the Romans will do anything for money. Why not gather all we have and scatter it across the breach? Then, when they stop to pick it up, we can jump them." "We have not enough coins to hold 3 men, Jevin growled. "We have been all over these things 100 times, Eleazar said, and we are right back to the same old choices. Do we stand and fight, or try some means of escape? And I have yet to hear any scheme for escape worth trying." Then a high, thin voice called out, "You got us into this. You must get us out." It was Uzel, who had wanted to go down to the Romans with Zidon. "Why did you refuse Silva's offer?" "I told you his only offer was slavery, and wasting breath accusing me of things past is not going to help us now. Oh, I say once more, you should go down to Silva and tell him anything he wants to hear. Make him change his mind." "I'm not God." "You act like him." Eleazar advanced on Uzel. He raised his hand to strike him, then suddenly lowered it. "You are right, Uzel," he sighed. "But I am only a little man, like you. It is not a very pleasant discovery, is it?" There fell upon all of them now a long silence, and the words of Eleazar's admission seemed to be echoed and re-echoed by the roar of the flames. Then, very suddenly, as if the power of his despair had somehow affected the natural desert, he felt a change of the wind on his cheek. Unbelieving, he touched his face, looked about him, and then ran to the brink of the rampart, where he could look toward the place where the western gate had been, and he was amazed to see how the wind had swung about until now it blew from the north and carried the flames toward the Roman tower. Even as he watched, the Romans began abandoning the upper works of the tower, and those below retreated from the intensity of the flames. "Hillel!" Eleazar called out triumphantly. "God has answered you! Send him our gratitude!" Now at last Eleazar knew they would have the full night to do all that must be done to achieve victory. (7.3.4) The Arab bowmen in the top of the tower were the first to flee the intolerable heat. They scrambled down the ladder, and even their Roman centurions conceded they had been nearly baked alive. The flames did not reach the tower decks of the tower, nor did the fire nor more than warm the night air about the legionaries on the ramp. Yet the moment the wind changed, Silva knew he would not take Masada on this night. It must be that miserable goat, he contemplated. He complained to the tribune, Metellus Nepos. He was trying to make light of the setback, more for his own sake than for any effect his levity might have on Nepos. He could not recall ever having known the fortunes of war to be so capricious. That flea-bitten goat did not want to be sacrificed, so he fouled the auspices. I thought all through the ceremony he looked like a Semite. When Silva called the tribune Cerilius and his centurions to meet him, he asked if the ropes should be slacked and the tower allowed to slip down the ramp, away from the fire. Cerilius looked up at the flames and said nothing, as Silva knew he would. But Lupus, the centurion, was also studying the flames, and at last he said, "In my opinion, sire, we stand more chance of losing the tower if we slack the ropes than from the risk of fire. Our tackle is not designed for descent." An instant of overload, a sudden slip, and our fixed blocks could be torn right out of the earth. And I now doubt the flames will do much except heat the iron plates. See how the air is rising above the fire in spite of the wind? Silva turned away from the fire and looked down at the long columns of the legionaries deployed along the ramp. They had been waiting since early afternoon, and he knew exactly the trend of their spirits. By now, sullen with inaction, they would have transferred all their hostility from the Jews to more familiar aggravations. What was the delay? The stupid engineers had never been able to do anything right, much less on schedule, and undoubtedly, Silva thought, his own name would be mentioned in combination with many colorful adjectives. He looked back at the illuminated escarpments of Masada. The Jews were certainly not going to come down, he decided, and because of the flames, they could not construct another wall in the same area. He pulled off his helmet and beckoned to Attius. He wiped at the accumulation of sweat, dust, and soot on his face and said, "Sound withdraw. Pass the word, we will take Masada in the morning." When he had returned to his tent, Silva found he was exhausted. Then, even after Epos had bathed him, he found he could not sleep. So in time he rose and poured himself a full goblet of falernum. He stared at the liquid shimmering in the candlelight, then suddenly threw the goblet across the tent and sat down at his table. He sat for a long time blinking sleepily at the single oil lamp and trying to discipline his unimaginable thoughts. Should he spare the Jews on Masada when it was taken tomorrow as a gift to Sheva, the Alexandrian? If so, how? The legionaries have not endured all these months to meet the Jews and coddle them. And they were a miserable stew of people anyway. You are a sentimental idiot. Sheva is a practical woman. She understands that being procurator of Judea is your duty and your business, and she is realistic enough to know you will have perplexities enough without the rabble on Masada mixing with the present population and infecting them with new dreams of revolt. How little these seditious people appreciate what is being done for them, and could be done. Ah, Sheva, how did you deserve the misfortune of being born a Jew? Now then, if somehow Eleazar ben Yair could be taken without serious wounds, Was it worth sending him back home as a sort of souvenir? Falco's idea, and a bad one, because it suggested the war was not over when it was said to have been long ago. The appearance of a Jewish leader in Rome at this late date was precisely what Vespasian was trying to avoid. He just wanted to hear confidentially that the last stubborn Jew was dead. Silva slumped far down in his chair and forced his thoughts away from Sheva by composing the draft of a letter he would send to Vespasian. Flavius Silva to Vespasian, our esteemed emperor. None of the familiar, as you would begin a second letter to Titus. Next, of course, the letters S for salutem. During the morning of this day, I had the honor of commanding the 10th Legion during the capture of Masada. Clumsy and patronizing, you imply that Vespasian does not know the 10th is here, which he most certainly does, and you employ the word during twice in the same sentence. During the morning of this day, I had the honor of commanding our forces in the Judean desert, and I am pleased to report, pompous in the extreme, and no man is more quick to be annoyed by pompously than Vespasian. On this morning, at such and such a time, we took Masada. There, that was better. Silva closed his eyes and dozed. As he drifted through a limbo of half-wakefulness and dreams, he saw himself return to Praeneste. He was standing on the terrace with Sheva, and she was smiling. Then Antonius Mamilianus appeared and presented a bill for the construction of a supping tower, while Mamilianus enthused about the incomparable view to be enjoyed during meals. Silva heard himself explaining. If you pay one as monthly for the use of 100, my dear fellow, in 100 months the interest will equal the capital. In other words, at 12% per annum, I cannot afford the tower, much less the food to be consumed therein. Cancel everything. Then Sheva appeared in the tower and announced she was not the daughter of an Alexandrian shipper, but of Vibo, his banker, and the interest of all that had been built at Praeneste was cancelled. He was awakened by the voice of Rosianus Gemenes, who stood before him, his bulk so strangely exaggerated by the candlelight he seemed a giant. "Sire," he growled, "the wind has swung about again, and the Jews have set fire to everything on Masada.